Hello, this is Ingo Swann, the author of Penetration, the question of extraterrestrial and human telepathy. And you're listening to the wonderful 21st Century Radio with the amazing Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Attention! Uh-oh, here we go. Well, welcome back to 21st Century Radio. I'm what's left of Dr. Bob Hieronimus. Our executive producer and research assistants, Laura Kortner. Our engineer is Anita Brockington. And this is hour 2 of our 2-hour special on the newly released special edition of Penetration, the book by psychic Ingo Swann on the question of extraterrestrial and human telepathy. Ingo died in 2013, and a few years later, his estate was moved in his archives to University of West Georgia, where many exciting discoveries have been made by researchers working there. Among them, our subject tonight, the newly discovered chapter on previously unknown remote viewing sessions to Mars that Ingo Swann did in concert with several other psychics over the course of several experiments in 1975, 1976, and 1984. And besides, you know what tonight is? Today is happy birthday to Laura Kortner, Dr. Laura Kortner. Kortner, he's been on this show for almost 30 years. I think it's on, 30 years. It is the longest show of its kind in the world at this particular time. But who knows what's going to happen elsewhere, especially when you're in Australia or something. Our next guest is featured in this new chapter on the remote viewing of Mars in 1984 as individual number 2. He is Tom McNear, a retired lieutenant colonel in the U.S. Army and the only student of the many that Ingo trained in the scientific methods of remote viewing to complete the training all the way through. Tom was a member of the Army Psychic Spying Program known today as Stargate and the first member trained in remote viewing by Ingo Swann. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Tom McNear.
Hi, Dr. Bob. Happy to be with you this evening. I'm sitting here in my Ingo Swann T-shirt, and I'm ready to go. But before we get started, I'd like to say hi to Dr. Krippner.
Oh,
Dr.
yes.
Dr. Krippner, while we never met, I can assure you that Ingo spoke of you often, both as an excellent researcher and a good friend. And I'm happy to be on the show with you tonight. Thanks.
Well, thank you. He was obviously my mentor and my doctoral chairman, and boy, is he tough. He may be a good friend and all that, but you better work. Okay. Now, can you talk briefly about how you came to know Ingo Swann and how he came to be your mentor?
Well, as you said, in 1981, I was selected to be a member of the Army's Psychic Spying Program known as Stargate. And I met Ingo in early 1982 at Stanford Research International in Menlo Park. For almost 4 years, from 1982 to 85, Ingo trained me in what some call a psychic skill, remote viewing. In fact, as was said, Ingo is known as the father of remote viewing because of the early research he conducted with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ, and his ability to train people in remote viewing, me being one of those. He coined the phrase remote viewing. I was the first officer he trained and the only member of the Stargate program he trained in all of the known stages at the time. I left the program in 1985, but Ingo and I remained friends up until his passing in 2013.
Well, Ingo Swann taught you to remote view. Can you tell us a little more about what remote viewing is and how it works?
Well, I can tell you what remote viewing is, but to this day, no one can tell you how it works. There are theories, but none is widely accepted. Remote viewing is the ability to perceive and describe detailed information about a person, place, or thing that is separated from the remote viewer in distance or time. A remote viewer can provide great details about a person or an object in the next room, or as we'll discuss tonight, even on another planet. Neither distance nor time is a limiting factor for remote viewing. A good remote viewer can go both forward and backward in time. And as we've discussed tonight, the time factor is a little difficult to understand, and we'll discuss about that a little later on. A remote viewer can describe an object or location and can also identify smells, textures, temperatures, tastes, all those sensations associated with our normally accepted five senses. But we can also sense so much more beyond our normal five senses. The Stargate program lasted from 1977 until 1995, and the Department of Defense and other intelligence agencies used remote viewers from the program to provide intelligence about locations that were inaccessible by any other means.
Will you note that part of the training is not just to understand how psychic signals present themselves, but also how to avoid allowing the ever-present analysis to interfere? And that must be pretty tough. Can you explain that further for our listeners? How do you learn to avoid analyzing and second-guessing what your intuition is telling you?
Well, I can try. Remote viewing is more about describing your perceptions of things than naming things. It's intuition versus analysis. An example I often use, suppose I ask you to describe something hidden from you in a large box. You perceive something as round, orange, textured, pliable, less dense on the inside than the outside. Well, if you stop there with just these descriptors, you'll likely be pretty accurate. Especially first-timers, we find that first-timers are hugely accurate. But your analytic mind is likely not satisfied with that. And it logically says, oh, well, it must be a basketball. Well, it may be, but it may also be an orange or a pumpkin. But if your analytic mind has called it a basketball, well, from that point on, all you're going to ever see is that basketball. So we stick with describing our perceptions and not naming things. Later on in my training, I often knew what the site was. In fact, toward the end of my training, I often named sites by their actual names. The Mayan Pyramid at Tulum, Oral Roberts University, or Bridal Veil Falls, for instance. But during much of my training, I was perfectly content reporting my perceptions, descriptors, and letting someone else decide what it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can see how that can work. Now, in the summer of 1984, Ingo asked you to participate in a special remote viewing team effort with 5 of you, including Ingo and yourself, viewing the same target at the same time. On the 15th of June, 1984, the 5 of you simultaneously remote viewed Mars. Can you tell us why Ingo selected you to be one of the 5 viewers to remote view Mars in 1984?
Well, as you said in the introduction, Ingo told Jim Mars I was his best student ever. In fact, in Sci Spies written by Jim in the year 2000, he quotes Ingo as saying that I was a better remote viewer than he was. So was I more psychic than Ingo Swann, the father of remote viewing? No. But Ingo said my superpower was my ability to turn off my analytic mind and not allow it to interfere with the incoming psychic signals. So I believe Ingo selected me because he felt like I had something to offer the team.
Did you find that very, very hard to do?
Not really. In fact, when we talk a little more about actually going to Mars, I have had these perceptions in my head for 36 years now, and I have avoided analyzing them or trying to turn them into something that they may not be. So sometimes it's not easy. Sometimes your analysis wants to jump to a conclusion as to what the site is. Mm-hmm. But I like being correct. And my perceptions, my descriptors are mostly correct, but my analytical judgment may not be. So it's easy for me to keep that at bay.
Well, tell us, please, what it was like to conduct the remote viewing of Mars as part of Ingo's team on the 15th of June, 1984.
This will be a long one.
Okay.
And let me begin by saying that I'm going to present a different viewpoint from your first two guests. So
That's
here
good.
we go.
That's good. We need different viewpoints.
Ingo received NASA photos from someone at SRI, and we're not really sure who that was. And then he picked his team of 5. Because I had a very sensitive security clearance and intended at some point to continue my career in the intelligence field, I asked Ingo not to reveal who I was. And viewer number 4, if you noted in the book, there were 5 of us. Viewer number 4 was also a member of an intelligence organization, and he made that same request. And to this day, I don't know who viewer number 4 was, and he probably doesn't know who viewer number 2 is unless he's listening tonight. But there were 5 of us, and we were in several different time zones. So we had to view at different times to ensure we were all there on Mars at the exact same time. At the exact same time, as Ingo specified. So for me, it was 17:30 or 5:30 p.m. Eastern Time on 15 June 1984. First, we conducted a remote viewing of Mars, the planet. No particular location on Mars. I found myself on the edge of a crater, and I can remember this just as clearly as if I were there today. The sky was rather dark and foreboding. I described it as oppressive. And Mars is about half the size of Earth, so the horizon was very much curved, not like the relatively flat horizon we have here on Earth. And the crater was very large and flat-bottomed with steep sides. The soil in the crater was very fine, silty soil with small, sharp lumps in it. The lumps felt like sharp crystals. The color of the soil was hard to describe. It was sort of a orange, red, brown, black. Put all that together. Well, anyone who has seen photos of Mars from the Mars rovers knows what it looks like now. But this was back in 1984. I had to take a short break at that point. I said, this is all just too much. I felt like a child trying to see everything all at the same time. But after a moment, I began to sense magnetics. I said the magnetics had a sharp waveform, whatever that meant. But as I said earlier, remote viewers can perceive data well beyond our normally accepted 5 senses. After describing this unspecified location on the surface of Mars, we all opened our sealed envelopes containing the geographic coordinate for a more specific location on Mars. And that's when the remarkable information began to flow. The coordinates were of a crater, thought to contain city-like ruins, and on the rim of the crater was a huge pyramid-like structure. I didn't perceive the city-like ruins within the crater, but I perceived and described in detail the pyramid structure. I said it was very old, and it was there for a specific unknown purpose. Well, unknown to me. It was castle-like. Everyone in the group of 5 perceived the pyramid, and everyone said it was huge and had a large open chamber inside. I perceived that it had something suspended from the ceiling of the chamber, like a pendulum, like a giant timepiece. I remember being excited and struggling with what to call what I was sensing. I remember saying, if I was on Earth, I would call this structure man-made. But because I was on Mars, well, you could see the confusion I was experiencing.
Sure.
In Penetration Special Edition, Ingo stated that there was little variation in the reporting of the 5 viewers, and he goes into detail of what each of us talked about. I encourage everyone to read this new special edition of Penetration. But I provided data that went well beyond structures. I sensed the energies of entities on Mars. Now, it may have been the other 4 people who were also viewing Mars at the time, but maybe not. I didn't see them per se. I didn't see them, but I would recognize them again if I met them. I know that doesn't make any sense,
Yeah, that's hard to
And we communicated. I didn't speak, nor did they, but we understood each other. The nature of our communication is something I still will not discuss today. I want to keep that crystal clear. I don't want to cloud it by trying to describe it to somebody else. So I will stop about the discussions we had. But were those entities there in the past? Are they there now? Or will they be there in the future? I can't truly answer that. As Dr. Schwartz said in the beginning, time is confusing. And when tasked against coordinates, it's assumed that we're there in the present unless you were told to go there another time. Joe McMoneagle, as was mentioned, was tasked against Mars in the distant past. But one of the things we sometimes find about remote viewing is that the viewer is sort of drawn to things, or perhaps times, that they find most interesting. Entities on Mars is certainly something I find interesting. Ingo did not report this additional information in penetration, and I'm not sure why not. Perhaps he reported only the perceptions common to all 5 viewers. Or perhaps he was wondering how to use this additional data in the chapter and maintain his credibility.
Sure.
Perhaps this is why he didn't include that chapter at all in the 1998 edition of Penetration. But one thing I did say, which Ingo included in Chapter 9, was that the pyramid was there for a very specific purpose. I didn't know that purpose, but I said when we find it, we will understand. Unfortunately, it's unlikely that we'll find that pyramid in my lifetime. But for me, I stopped the viewing at 6:19 p.m. I was exhausted. Immediately after the viewing, each of us packaged up our viewing materials and mailed them to Ingo. He was anxious to get all of our materials, and in my haste, I failed to make copies of it. In those days, we didn't all have our own copiers, at least I didn't. I figured I could get them from Ingo anytime I felt like I needed them. There is so much more I could report, but I have resisted discussing it for the past 36 years. Why? Because I only understand what I saw in that vaguish, dreamlike, remote viewing sort of way. What I witnessed is too profound to speculate on it and accidentally mislead anyone or even myself by mislabeling what I experienced. But in 2014, 30 years after our group viewing of Mars, I was reading Joe McMonagle's book entitled Mind Trek. Reading it, I found that he had remote viewed Mars on 22 May. That's 24 days prior to our group went there. Mm-hmm. And in Mind Trek, Chapter 16, Joe describes much of what I had encountered. As I was reading his book, I was about to burst with awe and excitement. So similar was our reporting that I wonder if somehow I had remote viewed his reading, or my reading of his book, 30 years later. Joe was viewing Mars in the distant past. He was tasked against the distant past. I was not. I was tasked simply against Mars. But Joe spoke of the same entities, the same profound sense of loss, the same structures and inner chambers. Reading Joe's book brought back all the memories of my experiences on Mars. I wanted to review my materials and correlate them with Joe's reporting, but I didn't have them. As I said, in my haste to get them to Ingo, I didn't make copies. And Ingo had passed away the year before. That was 2013. Ingo's archives are located at the University of West Georgia, and they're helping me to locate my materials in those archives, and I hope someday to find them and compare them with Joe's data. But if you want to know more than I'm willing to say tonight, if you want to know what I experienced, I recommend you read Joe's book, Mind Trek, specifically Chapter 16.
Okay, we will definitely do that. Well, we got we didn't get a physical copy. We got a what? On Kindle, yeah, on Kindle, which I don't I prefer to read the book, actually, the paper. Now, one thing you most remember about your viewing was this drawing, not a sketch, but a drawing that you made afterward of a hollow pyramidal structure. Can you tell us more about why you thought it was so important?
Why was it so important?
Yes,
well,
sir.
For one thing, it was on Mars. And when I located the pyramid, I knew it wasn't just something that was left behind. It was put there for a specific purpose, and it's still fulfilling that purpose today, and that's the important thing. At the time, I knew it was important. It was there for a very specific purpose, but I didn't know what that specific purpose was, and I still don't. But the statement I experienced during that session in 1984 was, I don't know what it is or its purpose, but when we find it, we will understand. While remote viewing, I usually make freehand sketches of what I perceive, but for this I got a ruler and a pen and paper and did the best rendering I could. It was important.
I'm very anxious to know more about what that pyramid looked like, because as you note that it had certainly an opening, right?
It had an interior.
An interior.
And I was in the interior. I don't know whether I went through an opening or whether my perceptions went into the pyramid.
I see.
One of those things it's hard to describe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tom, one final question, and it's a big one. Has any of this information been verified by NASA Mars rover missions?
Well, it's a great question, Dr. Bob. None of the rovers have been sent to the locations where the team perceived the structures, so there's no confirmation of that data. But I knew the smell of the soil. It was acrid sulfur smelling. I said it burned the inside of my nose.
Oh.
And there's an interesting story about that. I described these smells in 1984. 20 years later, in 2004, an online site known as Mars Daily ran an article that basically said we will never know what other planets smell like because our astronauts are sealed in spacesuits and consequently can't smell anything. I thought, well, that's probably true. But then in 2016, 12 years later, an article was written, and that's 32 years after my viewing of it. NASA announced they had formed a compound of the various elements in the Martian soil and found Mars smells, quote, slightly acrid with grassy smells of sulfur compounds.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, that was confirmation of my perceptions.
Good
I thought,
going.
well, I could have told NASA that 32 years ago and saved them a lot of time and money.
Yeah. We're just about a little out of time right about now. We certainly have enjoyed you coming on again, and we expect in the future sometime that you can join us a third or a fourth time. Can you do that?
I would like that, Dr. Bob.
So would I.
Thank you for letting me be part of your panel tonight. It was a privilege and a pleasure.
Thank you very much for joining us, retired Lieutenant Colonel Tom McNear, the first and best student of Ingo Swann's scientific remote viewing. Friends, go right now to www.ingoswann.com to buy this book called Penetration. There are also many more links to learn more about scientific remote viewing on our website, 21stcenturyradio.com, and even how to learn it yourself. Tonight's show is an advanced course for those already familiar with these subjects. If this is all new to you, check them out and get informed. Coming up next is Dr. John Brandenburg, who is going to tell about the early days of the Mars mission investigating Cydonia and the face and pyramids on Mars. We'll be right back.
This is Dr. John Mack, author of Passport to the Cosmos, Human Transformation and Alien Encounters. You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus.
Well, as it turned out later on, after some other developments had taken place, in this first time when I was with him, he kept every once in a while he would refer obliquely to telepathy and what did I know about telepathy and so forth and so on. And I actually didn't know very much at that time, but I did. Well, I knew more than most people, but not a whole lot. And so I told him what I knew, I thought that his interest was in remote viewing the moon. But in fact, in retrospect, he already knew what was on the moon, and his main interest was in telepathy.
Mm-hmm.
And because the people on the moon are not us, of course, and they were so shocking to say it, it's so incredible that they knew I was there telepathically at that time when I first saw them. I mentioned, I think they know that I'm here because they all were looking in my direction, kind of type of thing,
Mm-hmm.
So the hidden agenda of this remote viewing thing was telepathy, and that indeed turned out to be the case a year later.
That was a little clip from the original interview we did with Ingo Swann about this book in February of 1999. Our final guest is plasma physicist Dr. John E. Brandenburg, one of the pioneers in Mars anomaly research and author of numerous books, publications, and reports. Throughout his career, Dr. Brandenburg, John Brandenburg, of course, has worked on the microwave electrothermal plasma thruster for space propulsion. That's, of course, the vortex theory of rocket engine design. I know all about that, of course. And an architectural study for a human Mars mission using solar electric propulsion. He has been a frequent guest on 21st Century Radio, starting with his first appearance 29 years ago. 29 years ago! We asked John to join us tonight because he remembers working down the hall from Lambert Dolphin and others at SRI, Stanford Research Institute, in 1983 and 1984, at the same time when Ingo Swann was tasked with this group remote view of Mars. John's going to share with us what he knows about the Defense and Intelligence Department's interest in the anomalies on Mars and their use of psychics to find out more. Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, John Brandenburg, and thanks for agreeing to join us tonight.
Oh, Bob, it's such a great pleasure and honor to be on your show again.
Thank you.
I always enjoy it.
Well, we always enjoy you, too. John, yeah, we do, of course. John, you read the new Mars chapter. You read the new Mars chapter in the special edition of Penetration by Ingo Swann, as well as the transcript of McNear's remote view, of course. What did you make of the descriptions of what these groups of psychics saw in the very area of your intense study, that is, the Cydonia region of Mars?
Well, this was all very validating. I was first made aware of this all 2 years ago by some contact with people who had been part of the remote viewer group at SRI. And I learned from them that at the time when Dick Hoagland was running the IMIT, Independent Mars Investigation team, that we called it IMIT, that was headquartered at SRI, and we were working with Lambert Dolphin and a guy named, I think his name was Robert Beatty. But anyway, the remote viewer people were just down the hall from them. I mean, I was at Sandia National Labs at the time, working on Death Ray, which is one of the reasons I got involved in the Mars thing. I wanted to help end the Cold War somehow before it ended us. But basically, if you look at the CIA released thing of, I believe it's McGonigal, if you march down those sets of coordinates he gives, those are all areas. First was Cydonia Mensa, 40 north, about 8.96 west. That's where that's Cydonia Mensa, the whole complex there. And of course, they found a big pyramid. And then the next place was a place called Deuteronilus, which was 46 north and 3.2 west. And there's this big pyramid there. on the edge of a crater. It's completely anomalous geologically. We had investigated it as part of our team. We found out it was the tallest object for 200 miles on Mars, and that's reflected in the discussion of it, which they said was a circular basin with very, very tall objects around it, and there's something really big. Everything's big. So there was basically an obelisk. That's how it appeared to the remote viewer when they investigated it. And so that's at roughly 46 north, 3.2 west. And then there's another area called Galaxis Chaos, which we discovered, which has it actually has two faces. One of the faces looks just like the face in Cydonia. It's about two-thirds of the size. And I will comment that was my own personal discovery.
Congratulations.
I ordered the picture sight unseen because it just looked like an area very similar to Cydonia Mensa. And so I figured if people were building something at Cydonia Mensa and they were, it was a planetary culture, they'd build something at this place called Galaxis Chaos. And so that is at about 34 north, 112 west. And so, let's see, maybe it's east. Well, anyway, so they basically went down the list of places that we were interested in. In the remote viewing exercise being done by Project Stargate and the CIA, they just went down the list of areas that we were interested in. They also went to the Pyramids of Elysium. They also went to the Inca City. That was one of the last places they visited where the fellow felt he was in contact with beings there who were a dying race. They were resigned to their death. And he got the image of a planetary catastrophe that had occurred on Mars. It looked like the planet had gone through the tail of a comet or something. In other words, it was a catastrophe from space that had destroyed Mars. So this was all very validating to me. There was a great quote. It was from General Omar Bradley. He was talking about the campaign in Normandy after D-Day, and he said, it's great, they were reviewing the history of it, and he says, well, it's great to drive down the road in broad daylight, but back then we were driving it down in pitch darkness. we didn't know what we were doing. And so that's how I kind of felt at the time. I had involved myself in this investigation because I wanted to help end the Cold War, and which, was just so acutely present at Sandia Labs. It was a desert fortress. It was on Kirtland Air Force Base in Albuquerque. Mm-hmm. And so I knew I was risking my career. I had just gotten out of graduate school with my Ph.D. in plasma physics, and suddenly there I was working on this directed energy weapons program. And let's just say the Cold War was all around us, and it looked like we could easily get into a nuclear exchange by accident. So I felt this acute desire to try and do something about it. And so I involved myself in the Mars investigation, figuring that would change human history and make the Cold War moot. Mm-hmm. And as it turns out, the government was investigating furiously behind the scenes itself. We now know. I've had several people whose word I trust completely because I worked with them during that period. They were in the intel community, and they have confided in me now, and really within the last year, that at the time when I was telling them about this stuff on Mars, they were going to meetings about it, at the various three-letter agencies all the time.
Good.
This was an object of intense interest by the U.S. government. But they did not want to know anybody. They didn't want anyone to know they were interested, so they kept it absolutely secret. I was also told, by the way, that there were many pictures. Later in the Viking mission, Vikings took excellent pictures. They lowered the orbits of both spacecraft. They were orbiting Mars, where their main mission was done. And they took a lot of pictures at very high resolution of a lot of these sites. And I was told that many of those pictures have never been released to the public and were used by the U.S. government to make an evaluation of whether this was a dead civilization on Mars. They refused to tell me what the conclusion was.
Well, we need to take a pause here, and maybe you can add a little bit more to that when we come back. Our guest is Dr. John Brandenburg, and we are talking about these early days in Mars anomaly research that coincide with the time period that Ingo Swann writes about in Penetration, Special Edition, the question of extraterrestrial and human telepathy. Get more information at ingoswann.com or theprophecyproject.com. We'll be right back. This is 21st Century Radio.
Hi, this is Mark Carlotto, author of The Martian Enigmas, and you're listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Bob Hieronimus. Expand your mind.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio with our guest, Dr. John Brandenburg. John, are you with us?
Yeah, sure am, Bob.
Okay. What do you think is the connection between Egypt and Mars that caused these covert intelligence operations to be interested in both?
Well, they're both places, apparently, of large carved monuments, like the Sphinx and, of course, the pyramids at Giza. The name Cairo, where the pyramids of Giza are located, means place of Mars. It means Mars camp or military camp. So El Kahira, and there's apparently some kind of psychic connection between. And yes, as a plasma physicist, I do believe in psychic stuff.
Well, sure you do.
You got to believe that if you're going to be a good plasma physicist.
You're damn right. You're damn right. Well, there's no two ways about that.
So it's very exciting. It's very validating to find out. At the time, we were worried that the U.S. government was ignoring all this stuff on Mars.
Mm-hmm.
Now we find out they were actually going crazy over it.
Does that surprise you?
No. Look, I worked in Washington, D.C. for 15 years. I had, a lot of high security clearances, none of them concerning this, by the way. It was all, gee, the Russians launched this missile and it did this. What can we conclude from it? And, those sorts of things. Fairly mundane stuff, just pointed at the Russians and the Chinese. But the fact that the government just really plays its cards close to the chest shouldn't surprise you.
No, it doesn't. Doesn't surprise me.
They don't want anyone. They get interested in things, and they don't want anybody to know they're interested in them. And particularly if they're developing psychic espionage, which the Russians were also trying to develop, then that's what you call ways and means, sources and methods. And the government doesn't want to talk about that. But what I found out over the last 2 years is that the U.S. government was obsessed during the 1984, 85, 86 period with the stuff on Mars.
Well, one thing that I know this is out of the blue here, but I had to spend little time going to Egypt in my relationship with our governor and President Sadat, who, it's just too damn bad that he was murdered the way he was.
Oh,
do you
such
realize?
a tragedy.
I know the kind of things that he and I talked about, especially about pyramids and the six-pointed stars and all these other symbols. It was just so lovely. He lectured me once.
Well, a president of Egypt, and he was a true Egyptian. He was not trying to be a Westerner. He was in fact, in my opinion, Western civilization began in Egypt. But he's part of a civilization that goes back, Rome and Greece were just little backwaters with people running around in bearskin rugs when Egypt was building the pyramids. So, yes, he would have that grasp of real history of the Western world and its symbology.
Well, I've spent about 100,000 years working on the Great Seal of the United States, and one of the things that he and I got when we got together, that's one of the things he talked about. He showed me something I already knew, which was he pointed to the six-pointed star above the eagle's head on the front side of the Great Seal, and he said, see this, Dr. Bob? That's Israel. And then he pointed out, hey, Bob, look at this. Look at this pyramid on the back of the $1 bill. Now, he knew I knew about the $1 bill because he had my doctoral thesis. I sent him my doctoral thesis. And
oh boy.
So it was really such a hell of an experience, and then having lost him, you could realize what a person he would be like right now. This would have been thrilling for him.
Oh, he would be sitting back in his easy chair and just laughing at everything.
He sure would. Now, oh, wait a second. We're better get on to my other question here. When you read the transcripts of these various psychic visions reported from the remote viewers on Mars,
Stubbeline, I've read the works of Stubbeline and also McGonagall. And
do you recognize them?
I just find it very validating. They basically were seeing the same things we were seeing. A civilization that had died out, evidence of a planetary-wide catastrophe that had taken Mars from being like Earth to its present state, and that the mass death that it had caused. I mean, my book, Death on Mars.
That's right. Yeah.
I will just mention that all of these sites, Elysium, Galaxis Chaos, the Crater Pyramid, they're all in there and discussed. As because I talk about our whole IMID investigation, and I was tickled that Stubbeline basically lost his job in 1984, probably in part because he became obsessed with Mars. And I know I was feeling the heat at where I worked that, I had, this was being used by people who didn't like me to cause me trouble at work. In fact, I did finally leave. I left, went to Maui for 2 weeks, and then went to Washington, D.C. to work on the Reagan Star Wars program. Which was a wonderful thing. And so I discuss all of this in my book, Death on Mars.
It's a great book. It's a great book. We talked about it for a couple of hours. And and for our New Year's Eve celebration, my son and I, my whole family is pretty much out here on the West Coast now, so we are all getting together. So my son ended up celebrating New Year's Eve with me, with some Coors beer and a case of Coors beer, and we were watching Dr. Strangelove. And just, Bob, we went through a real situation there during the Cold War. And during the,
Wow, during the early 80s. Are you aware of you're aware of Able Archer, right?
Yes.
Yeah, we came as close to a nuclear war as we'd had at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it was all secret.
Whoa. Well, we almost had that a couple of weeks ago from somebody that heads our country.
Yeah, well, I've been offered a job at the Iranian Air Defense Ministry.
Really?
They're looking for people.
Oh.
just kidding.
Oh, I know. Well,
but anyway, I'm just saying that at this period of my life where I really staked a lot on this Mars thing not blowing up in my face, which it easily could have.
Should have.
But no, I now feel very good about what I did. I've always felt like I was doing the right thing.
You always were, but you were vindicated. That's the key.
I've been vindicated to a great degree by this revelation that the only other way we could know about things on the surface of Mars was through the programs like remote viewing.
And we're about out of time right now, John. And I hate to say goodbye, but we're going to have to say goodbye. Thank you for joining us tonight, John. See you next week, guys. 21st Century Radio with Zahara.